Welcome to Shapes of Grief. This week I'm joined by one of our podcast listeners, actually. Sandra, it's really nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Sandra's joining us from Australia, has a little bit of Boston and a little bit of Canada in her also. And Sandra's going to be sharing with us a little bit of her experience of grief following the death of her husband, John, just in June 2019. And from the little bit of discussion I've had with Sandra already, I know that this is going to be a really rich conversation. So Sandra, give us a little bit of background. How does a Boston woman end up in Australia?
Well, that's a wild story. I actually left Boston or New England. I was living in New Hampshire most recently. But I left there in 1995 to live in Indonesia. And I was living there with my 10-year-old son, but it didn't really fit us. So we traveled onward and ended up here. So it was not really a planned thing, but it was something that suited us. So we stayed and been here, 20 years plus. So.
Okay. So you met John when?
I met John when I was 17 years old. And so that's quite a long time ago. I'm 68 now. And so I knew him for a long time. He was my soon-to-be husband's best friend. And we were in each other's lives through a couple of marriages each, but always as really good friends. And but then we lost contact for quite a number of years, and he got in touch with me again in 2017, and we've kind of been on ever since. It was, it took me a lot of years to realize he was the one. And when I finally said it to him, he said, "I've loved you for 40 years," and just never thought it would happen. So we had a intense, incredibly grateful love affair that we thought would last the rest of our lives. It did, in fact, last the rest of his life. He used to say we were a Thomas Hardy novel with a happy ending. And honestly, one of the first things I thought after he died was, he got the happy ending, and now I'm back to the Thomas Hardy novel. So I'm still in that novel, trying to figure out, like, how do I make the ending okay? How do I take what's happened with us and make it into something that I can live with in a positive way? And
it's an incredible summary, and it's so true that he had you for the rest of his life, and he had the happy ending.
Yeah.
And now what's your next chapter? Yeah. So back to 2017, and I think there's something about love after loss. You said there was a few marriages for each of you. And when you have been through several, I don't want to say failed marriages or marriages that just didn't last, when you then find love, it can be very deep and profound. And it can be something that we just don't take for granted because it doesn't happen that often in life.
Yes, that's true. And we sometimes would regret the years that we didn't spend with each other, but at other times, and most time, we were just grateful that what we brought to each other were best selves. We had both learned and grown through our various relationships and our lives, and I truly felt, and I think he felt the same, was that we were offering each other best selves, and with a wiser, more grateful, more joyful, clearer kind of ability. We were just present with each other and grateful every day. That it was us. It was interesting too, because a lot of my friends were amazed at how quickly I fell in love. But this was a man I'd known most of my life. So it wasn't the same as meeting someone and learning what they were like or learning to trust them. He had been literally my best friend for a lot of the years. And And we had never let each other down. He felt the same way about me, as like when he needed to feel good about himself, he came around me. And it was funny because I met a woman, he was living in North Carolina, and I met a woman who was a friend of his who had met him before I was on the scene or back on the scene. And she kept saying to me, John's so different now. John's so different now. And I'd look at him and I'd think, he's the same John I've always known. And then we were talking. So I said to him one night, I don't understand why Debbie sees you as different. And he goes, well, maybe it's this. He said, I've always been happy and I feel good when I'm around you. I've always felt that way. So I had always seen that John. I'd seen the John who he was when he was around me. And he saw the Sandy that I was when I was around him. So maybe that was different than how he was in the world generally. But it wasn't ever something that I'd seen, you know.
It's a good litmus test for love, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I wish I was wiser when I was younger, as I want to say to that. Yeah.
So what happened in 2019, Sandra?
Well, he died very suddenly. So he was a very, very, very active man always in his life. Because of various injuries over time, he turned to bicycle riding, but he never did anything by halves. So I used to say his middle name should be nothing in moderation, because he always did things fully. And he'd gone out for a bike ride like he did 2 or 3 times a week. And kind of the next thing I knew, the park police were knocking on the door, and they came to tell me that he died. So, I mean, they spent some time sort of trying to ascertain who I was and whether or not it was the right house, and then said they were sorry to inform me that he'd been found deceased. And that word just, I mean, I'm sure you can imagine, you may have experienced, but it was like the floor dropped away, and it stayed dropped for a long time, you know, where really couldn't find my bearings, couldn't get my footing. And I'd always thought of myself, Liz, as a self-aware person, and I was so shocked at the devastation that grief wrought.
Yeah.
And he and I were even talking, we even talked about it because we knew, you know, we came together late in life. He was 71 when he died. But we'd only been together a couple of years. So we knew we didn't have a lifetime, but we thought if we were lucky, we might have 20 years. We'd have at least 10. I mean, I never thought we'd have less than 10. Yeah. And I think he thought the same. And so, you know, so we did, but we did talk about, you know, that it having come together, it was going to be difficult to be apart, you know, not be with each other once one of us went and one of us would go. And even though we talked about it, and I was like, oh yeah, it'd be really hard. I had no clue. I had no clue that of what it would do and everything that it would shake, the foundations of all of how I saw myself. And you know, and I can't even blame it on the fact that we had, you know, a lifetime's worth of habits together, because we didn't. It had nothing to do with that. It just had to do with, I think, how fully I had invested myself in, you know, in us as a couple. And I think
it can happen so quickly.
Yeah.
It can happen so quickly. You can meet someone and, you know, you're hoovering in all the dreams you ever had for your future, and maybe this is it. Maybe this is what will make it finally happen for me in my life. And it sounds like you and John really had that together. When you say there, you thought you were self-aware. I mean, you are clearly a very self-aware person. Doesn't protect you from grief. It doesn't protect you from the shock of trauma. You know, no matter how self-aware we are or how much work we've done on ourselves in our lives, we can still be floored like the next person.
Yeah, that's true. But I also think that a big piece of that is the way we as a culture are so disabled, and it's the best word I can think of, actually, in terms of how we approach grief and death and loss. We just don't have the tools. We don't have the ready skills. We haven't spent parts of our life acknowledging the fact that we are all going to pass at some point. And I know that as a sort of an idea, I know it and I grasp it, and I've always sort of embraced the Buddhist idea that death comes in any moment, but still, the skills aren't there. And I think a lot of grieving people feel this, that part of the work of grief is teaching those people around you how to be there for you, because, and again, this goes back to the fact that we are so grief illiterate, and so, and I know others have used that term, but it's the only one that really fits, that it's just something. It's almost like the last taboo, like at one, I think when my parents were young, you didn't talk about money, and you didn't talk about sex. You don't talk about religion. You don't talk about grief and death, so maybe it's the
even there
about,
you said, we're eventually all going to pass, die, we're going to die. We need to start saying these words, because pass is like, we sort of dissolve gently away, and we're great at avoiding the words like dying and death and dead, and they're important words to use because they're unambiguous, and it calls in that reality. But Sandra, I want to first go back to your experience, if you're willing, and
absolutely.
I think just to share these moments it's so important, because other people can maybe listen to this. It's their first episode of Shapes of Grief they've heard, and they go, okay, there's my experience, or something that resonates with me. And I think immediately shoulders drop, and people can say, if somebody else has experienced this, then maybe I'm not weird, maybe I'm not broken, maybe there's not something wrong with me. And I'd love to hear you describe in your words, because everybody describes this differently, what those moments were like for you, those moments, those hours. You said the word deceased, when you heard that word deceased in the same sentence as your beloved John, what happened in your body? What happened in your psyche? What happened for you? If you can describe it in a safe way for you, one that doesn't trigger you, Sandra, but just that maybe puts words in an experience that's often so physical and intangible that we find it hard to put words on it sometimes. And that's why we talk about this grief illiteracy. There's often not words to try and describe it, but we have to find them and give them words, these experiences.
Well, my first sensation, and that was a great question, by the way. My first sensation was of being, that the word I used then was cleaved by the cruelty of what had happened. And so, like, cruel was the word that came up for me a lot, but also cleaved. And I said it was like the ground dropped away, and it was like that. I literally felt at one point in that night, I don't even remember how it happened, but friends started to show up. And at one time in the evening, I was standing in my kitchen next to the table where everybody was sitting and talking, but I was gripping the side of the bench. And I realized that I was doing that to keep me grounded so that I wouldn't float away, because I really felt like I was floating away. And I kept thinking, much as I appreciated that people were there, it was very abstract, and their conversation was very abstract to me. I couldn't attend to it and to make any sort of sense on it. But the thing that I kept thinking of was that I really wish they would go home so that John could come home and everything would be all right. And it was a bit of like this magical thinking, I think, in that moment. And
have you read Joan Didion's book, The Year of
I have, yeah. It's funny, I read it years ago, and then I read it not long after John died. I started to trawl through the grief memoirs. It was one of my ways to try to find things that resonated with me. Yeah. And so, yeah, so that was, I mean, the first sensation was definitely a physical one. And interestingly, I mean, that kind of lasted for a while, but I also became really concerned about what his experience was. So I don't know what I believe about death, life, the afterlife, any of that sort of thing. But my initial thought was that if he's aware in any way, you know, is he okay? How do I know he's okay? And so it almost became this desperate need to try to continue to care for him in an odd kind of way. But I realized that I was probably experiencing, if he was at all aware at what had happened to him, I was experiencing a similar thing, cleaved from my body. It's like, well, that's what happened to him. He was cleaved from his. Yeah, so maybe it was also a kind of a form of me trying to, or intuitively, you know, mirroring or mimicking his experience of dying.
It's disassociation, isn't it? You know, as well, when something is just too big for our psyche, we dissociate, we just cut it off, we cleave.
Yeah. And it took some key, I mean, I'm pretty good at this age at finding the supports that I need and finding the right people to talk to when I need to. So I have this wonderful group of friends and some family members that are, you know, they never fail me. And each of the people that I knew to contact and contacted gave me back a piece of myself in a way that reminded me, well, this is how you usually do this kind of thing, or this is how you usually do that, or you know, this is how I see you in the world. And all of those things kind of helped give me some, if not a sense of being solidly rooted to the ground, at least you know, footholds where I could put my feet as I was trying to move through those first days, because that was tough. And I remember at one point, I was in my bedroom getting ready, and I was getting ready actually to leave the home that John and I had shared. And I'm not prone to panic, but I think I felt a rush of panic kind of coming up. And intuitively, I just went upstairs to my laptop and started writing. And writing is one of the ways that I've always kind of grounded myself. And I literally felt myself come back into my body as I was writing. So I mean, I've known that before, but I reminded myself in that moment that, okay, this is what you need to do. And so I wrote prolifically, actually, in the first year after John died. And then at some point it sort of petered out. It became less of a need, but it was like I felt the need to document everything. And some of the things were a little bit panic driven, like I had to find every photograph I could find of us. I had to find, you know, every note that we'd ever written to each other. If there was something that I remembered then I couldn't find, I'd have a little bit of a meltdown until I found it. And so it was you know, a lot of actually ways of being in the world and in my day that are not natural to me, not things I normally do. Like I said, I'm not prone to panic, but there was some of that coming up. And
it's so very familiar in grief, actually. And I think this is, you know, we talk about grief literacy and grief awareness. People just think grief is something sad we feel when someone we love dies for a few weeks, maybe months. They have no idea of the depth and breadth of the experience when we lose someone we love in a way that you did with John, for example.
yeah,
And anxiety, panic, fear, anger, all of, you know, we become unrecognizable to ourselves and to others often.
That thing about being unrecognizable to myself was the thing that I found the most difficult, because, you know, like I've gone through my life and been pretty independent and pretty strong and pretty self-actualized, and all of a sudden I wasn't responding to anything as myself. And yeah, I mean, I've always previously described myself as an optimist, and that just flew out the window. I mean, that was gone. It's actually started to trickle back that my take on things is more optimistic than pessimistic, but it was gone. And so it was hard for me to look at me or look at the things that I was thinking and feeling and even recognize myself in any of it. And
who did you become in grief?
without, I mean, I was not suicidal, but I was interested in death. And I was suddenly fearless about death, because death was going to allow me potentially to continue being with John. I'm not with John, he's dead, I'm not. And so it was this barrier between us. Life was the barrier between us. I didn't have suicidal thoughts like I said, but I think if I, like plans or I'm going to kill myself, I never thought those things, but I didn't see the end of my life as something that I was thinking that I wanted to put off. It's like, if it happened tomorrow, that's fine. I'm there, and I think the only thing that kept me from fully feeling that is that there are people living that I love, like my son and daughter-in-law and some friends and some family. My son and daughter-in-law primarily, though, that until I can get my handle on grief and try to pass on some skills or some knowledge or some tools, I'm not ready to go, I think my grief propelled me towards subject matters that I've never really thought I'd be interested in before either. And I'm currently studying for a counseling degree, and it's actually, I'm not interested in anything other than grief counseling. It's all I want to do. So, when people say, we're going to study drug and alcohol counseling, it's like, well, that's great that those people are doing that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to be doing something different. And I love some of the words around that. Like, I love the idea of grief support rather than counseling, because it's, a lot of the issues with grief as being created by, or at least in part being created by, what our expectations are about grief. Like, we think we should be over it by now. We think this should happen by now. And like I said, it was 2 years before I think I was really moving, or beyond 2 years, maybe closer to 2.5, when I was really back feeling like I was standing solidly on the ground again, So if you'd weighed me against the DM5, I would have been into complicated grief for at least 1.5 years, and it's like, and I look at grief and I listen to other people's grief stories and I think, well, what grief isn't complicated? They're all complicated in one way or another, it seems. And
I think, and excuse me here, coughing, I have COVID at the moment. Got a little coughing fit there. It's impossible, like the DSM-5 has numbers on what's considered prolonged grief and what's considered normal grief, and they are quite arbitrary. For some people after certain losses, you might think that's quite a prolonged response. And then for other people after certain losses, it's well, of course, they're still deeply grieving and trying to integrate that particular loss, but we always have to look at each case individually, and like you said, you had this assumption that you had at least 10 years, hopefully 20, you knew that you were meeting later in life, that you were probably going to witness each other's death, or one of you would witness the other's death, but nothing was to prepare you for facing that just after 2 years. 2 years into the beginning of this new dream, this new life that you were creating together, which sounds absolutely wonderful, Sandra.
Yeah, it was wonderful, and those are the things that I try to hold on to. There was, I I've worked hard to be a compassionate and open person, but I found all of that stuff increased exponentially because John loved me. I was able to be my full self, open and loving in the world. And the task for me after his death was to remain open and compassionate and loving to the world without the safety net of John. And I'm still struggling with that. It's like, how do you do that? And he offered me a soft place to be protected and loved and lick my wounds if needed. And there isn't that now. And I've lived without that for most of my adult life, that soft place, but it got very cozy very quickly and allowed me to deepen and open. Yeah. So, I mean, he used to say quite often that I'd made him into a better person. Well, he certainly made me into one. And I want to keep her, and I know, like, early on too, people who love me and who've loved me for a long time, but they were, sorry for the difficulties I was going through and the struggles I was having. But saying things like, I just want you to get back to yourself. And it's like, she's gone, like she was gone when she fell in love with John. She's certainly gone now that she's fallen in love and lost him, so that Sandy's never coming back. And I don't think I want her to, that would be an erasure of everything I've done in the last 5 years. I wouldn't want to do that. So
you talked, Sandy, about grief illiteracy and just the culture around us, how death denying we are, and also grief denying. And I think this is a really interesting phenomenon, because we can go through so much pain when someone we love dies. But I think what people don't realize is that the absence of understanding friends, or the absence of people who just get what we're going through, can make it 100 times worse. It can really exacerbate that loneliness. And I love, like, you're so inspiring when you say, I want to keep her. How do I keep this love? Yeah. How do I not, something you said earlier as well, like you said, the task of the bereaved, one of the tasks is to educate the people around us who don't understand grief. And it's like, fuck, why don't you just know, I'm going through this, please step in and meet me in it. But no, not only do a lot of people not do that, but we have to tell them what we need, or bear the disappointment of not getting what we need also. Are we actually entitled to it? We some people in the grief space, there's a huge message of entitlement, which maybe we're not necessarily entitled to. But I love this part of you, which I really want to grab and pull out a bit more, where you really took your agency, like, rather than standing there and going, you're all letting me down, you all need to be grief educated, you all need to do better by me. You went, how do I not become that person? How do I continue to be in that soft place of love? How do I continue to let love beget more love and share that with my son and my daughter-in-law? How do I continue to be this nicer version of me that John helped grow and nurture? It sounds like at some point, when you got your ground, when you'd done your writing, brought yourself back in, stopped yourself from dissociating, integrated everything you'd been through, part of you went, right, it's up to me to nurture, my path moving forward.
Absolutely.
That made sense.
It absolutely did. And I think, it's not only that I did it in grief. I think I've done that throughout my life about everything. So that was maybe natural me coming back into, which is, if somebody's going to do it, it's going to be me, which is not to say that I didn't have help. I mean, there've been wonderful people along the way that have helped and certainly given me a lot of support. But but it's been incremental as well. And I think, so part of it for me, for I would say at least the first year and a half, and maybe even a bit longer, maybe more like 2 years, no, probably a year and a half. I was just trying to be in the process wherever that took me. And so sometimes that was scrambling after trying to figure out where John is in the afterlife. So I'm a by nature a researcher. If there's something, I live with a delusion that if there's something I want to know, the answer's out there somewhere, which I know isn't true about everything, but I'm still driven to think that if I look hard enough, I'll find the answer. So I've looked into a whole lot of things. Like I wanted to know, what his spiritual process is in dying. So I looked through all of this stuff, from Tibetan perspectives and, various perspectives about what the dying process was like. And I wanted to know how various people thought about the afterlife and, where John might be and how I might be able to contact him. And I was looking for, also one of the things that I was reminded of by my cousin, is that I have a tendency to create rituals. So in 2008, I did this whole thing about my ancestors, and I ended up carving petroglyphic stones and putting them in place in various places in the world. And I've always been drawn to create my own ways of marking the passages of my life. So, of course, I would do the same sort of thing in grief, but when I couldn't, the legalities of me not being married yet to John caused difficulties right after his death. I had no rights to what happened to him. I had no rights to see him. Anything that I wanted, like if I wanted to view him, privately or whatever, I had to ask permission from his daughters, and it was just difficult and problematic. And also because of the way he died without anybody else around. And so they had to take him into the city morgue, and then they had to determine the cause of death, which could have been a half an hour or an afternoon process, or it could have been a 5-day process, and they didn't know. So it was quite confronting, and it turned out not to be too long a period of time, but I wasn't able to see him. And like I was saying to you, I wanted to know if he was okay. I wanted to put my hands on his body and say, it's okay. It's okay. You're dead, but it's okay. And, we'll do what we have to do. I don't know. I just wanted to comfort him, and I couldn't go to him. So I ended up going to the place. I knew from the park police, the place at where he died, because it was some place that we'd hiked many times. I knew the spot. So I went there, and I actually left offerings on the ground and just sort of said a prayer. And I said to him, if any part of you is still here, just follow me home and I'll bring you to your daughters and it'll be okay. But I had to do something, and that was me. It was actually the first time I felt like I wasn't quite so scattered. So it was me acting like myself in the moment, I think. And
it's you're really claiming the relationship there as well. It's that famous quote from Tuesdays with Mari by Mitch Albrom, death ends a life, not a relationship.
Clearly.
And, in that moment when we hear that somebody has died, it's like that we're cleaved, like you said. It's a beautiful word to use to describe it, but then we try to find them again. We try to put that back together. Okay, he might be dead, but I'm still relating to him. He's still in my life. He's still someone I love. How do I do that? And it sounds like intuitively you did that, Sandy.
Yeah, in a few different ways, but that was the first. And I have a photograph of John in a little shrine up next to the kitchen, and I give him a cup of coffee every morning. I've done that every single day since he died. We used to have morning coffee together. I still do it. And, and it feels less, I don't know exactly how to describe it. I think at first it just felt like this terrible clenching and a pain, and the loss was more obvious than the connection. And now it's just like, good morning, love, here's your coffee. And it's not like I don't still feel his loss, but I don't feel it in the same way. You know, I think I've regained enough of myself somehow. Don't ask me how. Somehow that I can stand there and take a moment and go, I miss standing with you in the kitchen and talking about what our day is going to be like. I do miss that. But I can still give you coffee and I can still feel the love, you know. And
there's such a message of hope here, Sandy. And for listeners who are listening rather than watching, as you were talking about that pain, you clenched your chest right there where so many people do. And you said that it's different now. So it's been 2.5 years. And could you just describe that physical change?
yes,
Because I work with people who are still grasping their chest and feeling the agony of unexpected loss or even expected loss. Can you give them a little few words of hope where that's going to transform, where that's going to go? Where does that pain go, or how does it transform?
you know, I'm not sure about that. And this might not be hopeful words, because actually it was interesting falling in love with John when I did, because I was older and aware and had not been in a relationship for a really long time. So the openings of love were really obvious to me. And one of the things that it was a physical sensation of feeling like my chest really was cracking open. And I said that to him, you are cracking me open. And one of the things that I first noticed about the pain of grief was it was that same crack. So the love and the pain are the same feeling. And so I almost now feel a little bit like I've lost something, because I don't still feel that cracked open thing. And in a way, I'd like to get it back, but I'd like to get it back where it's love, not loss related, if you understand, you know? So yeah, so the fact that I don't feel it now, I kind of wonder if whether or not as a self-protective act, you know, my body or my psyche or whatever has just kind of dulled that a little bit just for the moment, so that I can, you know, get a running start on wherever my life's going to take me next. I don't know. And, you know, like it's all in a process. So none of this has been planned. It is strictly, you know, operating by gut more than anything I've ever done. This has been operating by gut, you know, like this is what I think I need to do. And I have a really wonderful friend here she's probably my closest friend, and she has struggled at times at what to do and what to say in order to help me, but she always asks the question, you know. So like one day I was talking again about John, and this was early on, and talking about him in quite a broken way. And she said, it always feels to me like you're ripping off the bandage. And I said, I like ripping off the bandage, because then I feel it, you know. But she commented and then listened, and she understood that it was, you know, even though she would like me to be over it, I'm not going to be over it. And that too is something I struggled with, was the words, you know, the words that are used around grief, you know, getting over, getting through, getting past. It's like, and I kept saying, I don't want to do those things. I want to be with my grief. And so I think that's what sort of propelled me for that first 1.5 years, was trying to learn how to stay in and be with whatever was happening. Yeah. And, you know, and sometimes that was, you know, a month or two of fairly dark depression and really isolating myself, or wanting to stay isolated. I mean, there were people who would call just because they wouldn't let me, but yeah, but allowing that to happen and not judging myself, and actually not trying to figure out why. I've read some of the sort of evolutionary theory about depression, and which I really like. I'm really attached to those kinds of things. So I was saying to myself, you know, I was like, well, what is my depression giving me? And actually what it gave me was a clarity about what I need that I hadn't been giving myself. And so one of those things was purpose, which was when I decided to start studying again, which was counseling. The other thing was to get out of my house on a more regular basis. And so signing up for those counseling classes ensured that I did that. And then the other thing was being amongst people. And because Western Australia has been fairly COVID-free, that meant we could actually have classes with others. And so my depression actually offered me those gifts. They made me clear about these are the things I need. And so,
When you say
yeah.
depression there, are you differentiating it from grief?
Yeah, I think I am. And I'm not sure exactly how I can explain it. So the grief, the depression just feels more like a pall that sort of hangs over me, or my experience of it is where I have no energy for anything, no interest in anything, no hope. And with grief, when I'm just in grief without the depressive piece attached, I'm still looking for grief theory that resonates, or I'm engaged in things. I am by trade and history an artist, and so working with things is something I do naturally as a way to kind of work through my issues. I'll pick up needlework, or I'll do something, and so yeah, so the grief can still be quite active. And in grief, I wanted to talk about John. In depression, I just wanted to hide from people, so it's it is different for me. And I mean, I know they can overlap, but yeah, for me, it was a bit different.
Yeah, it's good to differentiate, because grief is not depression. And it's really good to recognize these things. But I think one of the most important things you've said there is, how did I begin to see what I needed, what was causing the depression, what was the lack in my life, or the lack in my heart, and how can I begin to address that lack for myself? Like, that's incredible to have had the awareness and the willingness to do that, because I think sometimes when we don't get our way, or things don't, would like to, to put it in very simplified terms, when things don't work out the way we planned, like the love of our life dies, it's very easy to sit down and stomp on the ground, and the unfairness of it all, and life has let us down. And that's all true, and that's all valid. And if anybody responds that way, I completely get it. And there was a part of you that went, well, what did he give me that I could actually give myself to ease this grief a little bit? How could I meet my own needs in a way here?
Yeah.
This is, like we say in a good grief process, this is the dual process model, where we confront our grief, we mourn, we wail, we experience the depth of the loss, and then we oscillate over, and maybe we paint, we make dinner, we go for a walk, we talk with friends, and we go back and forth. We confront our grief again, we restore, we confront our grief, we restore. And they say that this oscillation process is, whether we're flexible as humans, or resilient or flexible, is what determines how well, if you like, we oscillate back and forth. But it sounds like you really had a hand on that oscillation process the whole time. Where's my agency here? And what can I do to be in the driver's seat of this?
Yeah, I think I had agency even before I realized that I had it. I remember at John's funeral, one of his daughters was talking. The funeral took place in the States, so I was living in the States when John died, and at the funeral, his daughter was talking about her group of girlfriends and how they all come together and they form a kind of a village when something happens. And, one person will figure out what to do about bringing the family food, but they all come together and they all figure out what to do. And so they're a supportive kind of network. And I remember thinking, where's my village? And it was Fremantle. And so John died in June. By the beginning of September, I was back. And so my friend who's here, the one that I was telling you about before, one of the things she kept mirroring back to me in that first year is like, she kept saying, you were incredible. It's what you managed to do, that you got you and your stuff back here, that you got back here, that you did all this. I came back here, I bought myself a car, I got myself an apartment, I was like, she said, you're amazing. And here I am just thinking, I couldn't even remember who I was really. And so the fact that she was mirroring that for me was incredibly empowering. And, I think I really clung on to that kind of mirroring from the people who cared about me, where they were helping me to see the strides I was making that were good for me and helpful for me. And yeah, I think they all are a little bit fearful because I've always been a little bit of an outlier. So they weren't quite sure how I would do things. And so when I make any sort of move for normalcy or security, they're all quite happy. And
I'm hearing as well the importance of psychoeducation to you, Sandra.
Absolutely.
You went to books, you obviously went to the podcast as well. Did you find a few podcasts, a few books that were particularly useful?
Well, I mean, some of them I found through you, and then later found them in the education program. But I immediately was drawn to Robert Niemeyer and the meaning making. I found a lot of power in Lorraine Headkey's The Crafting of Grief. That book is amazing. I think that's wonderful, and I love the idea of continuing conversations. So I think that comes out of narrative therapy a bit, but she champions that quite a bit. And it's the idea about bringing, how you bring the person's influence into the present, which clearly I've been trying to do from the beginning without even knowing there was a name for it. But that's what made sense to me. The idea of moving on without John doesn't make sense to me. Like,
continuing bonds.
Yeah, the continuing bonds is huge. And yeah, so there have been theories along the way that mattered, but I think you're right. I wanted to go back to that. The psychoeducation is the piece that's missing. And like, I became involved with a peer support grief group here after I started my counseling training, but because I wanted to meet the local community, and it's for people who've lost spouses. So it's specific to the kind of grief that I have suffered. But one of the things I notice is that there's a big difference in the members depending on how much they know about grief theory and how much they are weighing themselves against this really ridiculous, unworkable model that's sort of held up in culture that, and one of my frustrations is that is constantly part of like popular media. So if you watch a movie about grief or read a book about grief, there is always like this transformative moment where the person finally goes to the gravesite and says goodbye. It's like, I'm not going there, so give me something else, and to be honest, I don't know anybody who wants to go there, who's truly lost somebody they love. They don't want to say goodbye. And so if I had billions of dollars, I'd be putting together popular media that showed grief in its true glory. And with all of
this space, maybe you will.
Who knows?
Certainly, that's why I started Shapes of Grief podcast, was to debunk these myths. But you're so right. They're still being perpetuated in the media all the time. Sandra, I could talk to you forever, but I have a client in a couple of minutes.
Oh dear.
And
we can talk again if you like. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel that there's a whole other second episode, so maybe let's do that.
I'd love to.
You and I can email about that. I feel you've so much wisdom, from your experience. I think because of who you are, you've, if I can use the expression, it's like you grab grief by, like the bull grabbing the bull by the horns, and you've faced it square on, and there's a lot of wisdom to share when you are someone who's done that. It's like passing a baton on to other people, going, look, I don't know if this is right, but it's worked for me. It's making this survivable, and I've found my ground again. I've got hopes for my future. I've carved out a new career path. I'm making this new chapter worth living, is what it really sounds like, and that's valuable.
And talking about it, that's the big thing for me. It's like, this needs to be talked about. I love that you do that. I love that you're talking to me. I mean, I think the more this happens, the better it is, and the better for everybody, and it allows me to put together that toolkit to hand on to the people I love, which is, driving me as well. So.
Great. Well, Sandra, I will email you about part 2 of this conversation.
Oh, great. That's great.
Thank you so much for part 1.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to meet you. Bye.
Take care.